Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. We have Scott Ciesler from MadBarn with us again to talk about forage alternatives and other equine nutrition topics. If you didn't see the first few podcasts with him, I highly suggest going to watch those before or after this one because they're great. And he has a whole lot of information on equine nutrition that is fantastic. So, Scott, thanks for joining us again. I really appreciate it. And I'll let you take it away and you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, Shelby, thanks for having me on again. I think this is number 3, right?
Yeah.
I do appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun the last 2, and hopefully people are finding some value in uh, in the podcast. I'm the owner and founder of MadBarn. We've grown substantially in I guess the last number of years to a considerable size now, where we're providing upwards, I think, of 200 to 300 diet evaluations per week for clients or potential clients or just people interested in their horse's nutrition. Really fulfilling, I guess, the promise of why we started MadBarn, to provide the best nutrition and the best nutrition information for horse owners.
Perfect. Yeah, that's insane. So many diet analysis each week, but it's so helpful for everyone who does them. I did several for my whole herd, and it was really helpful getting all that information back. So the reason why I selected this topic is that in my area, like the Fraser Valley of BC, last year in the summertime we had a massive drought, and it resulted in like 2 months without any rain, which is unheard of here because it's a rainforest. So it burnt all the grass, and people who had their horses out on grass, there wasn't really anything for them to eat. And of course, we couldn't cut as much hay. And then to add to the problem, in the wintertime, we had what is called an atmospheric river, which is like an insane amount of rain, all in a short period of time. I think we ended up having like 300 millimeters of rain over the course of 48 hours. And this flooded a lot of places. It resulted in people losing their hay storage because their hay got wet and they'd have to throw it out,
Yeah.
which caused even more of a shortage. And then now this year, we're having a little bit of the opposite problem where it's now June, and typically by June, we would have had a few dry weeks where people could do their first cuts, but it's been so wet that no one has been able to cut. The only fields that I've seen hayed are for silage for cows because you can do that when it's wet. But we're very late on getting our first cut in, and following a hay shortage, that's not the greatest. So I wanted to do the forage alternatives because of that, because I think that it's going to keep getting harder to get hay.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, and I guess you brought up some very key weather factors that have happened in BC in the past 12 months, which have been significant, obviously. Um, I'm from Ontario, and although the rest of Canada thinks Ontario only thinks of themselves, we do get news from the rest of Canada, and we were keenly aware of some of the flooding that was happening in BC. But you bring up a point about the silages for cattle. Like, it's one thing we really don't do a lot of in North America, and that's feed fermented forages to horses, which you can. Now there are some issues with it. And the biggest one being botulism they talk about, and it's certainly, when you're in I don't want to call it emergency per se, but it's really not an option because it takes a lot of planning and storage mechanisms to do haylage or silage to feed your horses. So that's not really an alternative per se when you're kind of looking when you can't do hay or you're looking for alternatives. But it is something to consider, and it's something and even for metabolic horses and things like that, the fermentation process basically takes all the sugar out, so it makes it automatically makes it a low sugar forage, and it can still be quite high in energy, which is great for horses.
That's super cool. So with the haylage, if it's like, I know you mentioned in the last podcast that for like horses to avoid the botulism risk, you have to cut it a little bit higher off the ground, to avoid getting like any dead animals or anything that could cause an issue with the botulism. But with regards to like having the, like, so if, for example, if you got like the round bale haylage and you fed it outside in the sun, would it pose a threat to the horses being out in the sun, and heating up while being damp like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's feed out issues. Like, you wouldn't just drop a round bale of haylage and leave it for a week out there, because yes, it would absolutely start heating. You would get, I mean, when you make haylage, it's an anaerobic fermentation. That's why they wrap it in plastic or put in a silo or something. And then so as soon as you expose it to air, you're changing that fermentation pattern away from these lactic acid bacteria into largely mold producing yeast things will start to grow, like yeast and molds will start to grow on it, which then eventually will have deleterious effects on the health of your horse. So you wouldn't be able to do it like that. It would, and this I guess comes back to it would have to something like this would have to be planned, and
Yeah.
you'd have to have strategies in place and to deal with it and feed it. It's just, but longer term, is like there's bigger structural changes that happen, like fewer and fewer people make small square bales, even just from the labor standpoint. A lot of the hay comes from cattle farms. They're obviously getting bigger and bigger. So they move away from these things that are more appropriate for hay. Now, the horse industry is a large industry, so there are people who accommodate it and grow specifically for them, but it's not like it used to be back in the day. Every day you had cows around had small squares up in the loft. That just
Mhm.
doesn't exist anymore, right? So
Yeah.
there's the structural changes along with these kind of like climate related changes that we're referring to today that kind of drive some of these things that may make horse owners want to start looking for more permanent solutions to
Yeah.
depending on the dry hay or small square bales anyways for dry hay. And I guess that's what some of those what we'll talk about here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be cool if more people did start to cut haylage for horses because like most of the people that are doing it, it's just for cows. And like the cattle farmers are the only ones buying it right now. But it would be neat to see because if it, yeah, like you said with the lower sugar, that sounds like a plus. And then I'm assuming it would probably also be good for horses just to get extra liquid into their diet that they wouldn't get from dry hay. So it'd be interesting to see if we start moving towards that because especially in the climate that I live in with how wet it is, it definitely would make more sense because our climate's kind of similar to like the UK. And I know you mentioned in the last podcast that they do more of the feeding haylage there.
Yeah, they do. Again, and that's probably why, because it's hard. It's so hard. You don't get enough sun and dry days to actually make dry hay. And like now with some of the way they make haylage today, you can cut it in the morning and be harvesting in the afternoon. Um, and so it's a 1 day process almost. Again, none of this has been adapted for horses that I'm aware of. But there is the possibility to adapt this kind of style to the scale that would be workable on horse farms. Probably it's just it really hasn't been done to this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Largely
Maybe
here,
it's out of
there are
necessity.
some companies that are packaging it. You run into some just like price issues because you're like shipping water is obviously very expensive, and
Yeah.
so that's difficult. But there's definitely there's people kind of cracking at it a little bit. The other thing they do in the UK, and I don't know if we talked about this. I think we did talk about this in the last podcast, and talking about forage alternatives is straw.
Oh, yeah. So
And so
they
that,
feed straw?
pardon?
They feed straw there or do they mix it with like the haylage?
Well, they'll just feed straw as a portion, not as the sole fire like
Okay.
forage source. But basically, and as we kind of get in this conversation, we'll talk about this a little bit. You look at forage alternatives; they're largely the issue isn't nutrition so much like replacing hay from a nutritional standpoint. It's really the behavioral needs of the horse that you are trying to fill when you're using a forage replacement. The nutrition side, like from a chemical standpoint, to give their actual nutrient needs is easy.
Mhm.
What we're going to struggle with in any forage alternative system, like, is meeting their behavioral needs, and that's the need to forage for, up to 12 hour or longer. 12, 10 to 12 hours is kind of the minimum or what you would consider baseline level for them to need to forage per day. How do you meet that requirement? Using something like bee pulp, uh, brands, hulls, or these fibrous fractions of plant material where the horse can consume them so fast. It's not really meeting that foraging behavior. So, how do we make that balance? And then I think, again, we talked about some of the other podcasts. You start, looking at some of these paddock paradises where it's just like paddock enrichment. So they're doing other things besides, I guess, eating. But
Mhm.
then the feeding schedule becomes a bit onerous too, where you're, and I'll wrap this up in like more succinctly, I guess, at the end or later on. But your feeding schedule becomes where you're almost having to feed them every 4 hours or
Yeah.
something to keep keep make sure they keep eating kind of consistent flow through the gut even, and just generally making them happy. Like if you look at the work Ellis did back in, like, I think it was 2000. That group was looking at a lot of just feeding behavior, feeding differences between high concentrate, high forage. And one of the probably the most obvious, or I think the most one of the greatest observations that came from it was when they did a high forage versus compared to a low forage, and they basically just watched what the horses did, and they're like, okay, well, so on the high forage they spent, I think it was only 40% of their time eating. So even when that wasn't that high forage, because that doesn't get you your 12 hours, but most of
Yeah.
the time spent eating. And then on the low forage or high concentrate, they only spent like 25% of their time actually eating.
Oh
But
wow.
then when you looked at what they did the rest of the time on the high concentrate, they basically ate their own feces in their bedding. So
Oh.
it just showed this drive for the horse. Still, like, even though their nutritional requirement was met, with the high concentrate feed, they still want to just eat. And so you need
Hmm.
to find something for them to kind of fulfill that time,
Yeah.
preferably besides eating wood shavings and their own manure, because that's not a
Yeah.
desirable.
So straw would be an option then, like if you had to end up feeding more like hay replacers, like beet pulp or like soaked hay pellets or hay cubes.
Yeah.
You could add in straw or something to like what volume of that is safe to feed to them.
That's a good question. I'm not, because there's a lot of factors that go into that. I mean, chop length, you get it too, like, if they get it too long and they don't chew it enough, you can, you start to run impaction colics, not necessarily from the straw per se, but maybe not enough water intake because the straw is so dry,
Yeah.
or their dentition's just not quite right. And straw really has that waxy coating on it. Then you can physically chop it for them. Like, I mean, there's companies actually, selling bedding in those plastic bags. So there's a really nice dust extracted straw, which we actually recommend on a regular basis for your clients as a way for weight loss. And like, use this. It's already dust extracted. It's really clean. It's really good straw. Um, but if you chop it too fine, that also runs the risk of impaction colic from having like way too fine a material going into them. Um, so the maximum amount, like, generally just as a safeguard, we say 20% of the total dry
Okay.
matter intake. So if your horse is going to, the average 500 kilo horse at maintenance is going to need around 10 kilos of dry matter, we'd say up to 2 kilos of straw in the ration. And you can do things like, um, feed the straw in a bag, for instance. Like, let's say you're in a situation where you just can't get hay. So you're like, I have no hay. I need to feed this horse. Something like, okay, put 10 to 15% of the straw allotment in a bag. Don't give it all at once, preferably even twice or 4 times a day, just to, again, spread out this thing. And then take the other 5% and in your beet pulp mash or your whatever you're going to use, whether it's a brand beet pulp or, um, some grain byproduct, essentially, or forage that's been pelleted or cubed. Mix the actual chopped straw into that blend too to slow them down because funny enough, like if you compare beet pulp to like pelleted hays or like pelleted timothy or cubed timothy, the horses actually eat the pelleted forage faster than they eat the beet pulp.
Crazy.
So if you're talking again about you're like you want to fill some time, basically, like, I'm fine trying to fight feeds to fill some time. This pelleted forage actually they consume faster, which is strange. I don't know if it's a particle size thing, a hydration rate. I'm not exactly sure why, but it just is. But by adding even just a little bit, like 5% or less of that mash and straw, will really increase the amount of chewing time, which increases saliva production and just increases the time it takes them to consume it. So there's, little strategies that you can kind of throw in there to increase your feeding times, even with some of these forage alternatives that you may use.
Yeah, that's really great. And then with like the beet pulp, it like is there are there risk factors depending on how much you feed? Because if you ran out of hay, for example, and you needed to give the horses something until you can source more hay, how much is safe to give them like on a day as a daily ration?
These are good questions. So again, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into this. Like you can adapt a horse to eat, I would say easily 30% of their dry matter in beet pulp without too much issue. The question is how quickly that change happens. You have to remember, like a lot of these byproducts, beet pulp, soy hulls, the brands have really rapidly fermentable fractions in them. So when they hit the hindgut, they, they're readily digestible to the bacteria and the gut will adapt to it over time. But if you just went, say, I have hay today, tomorrow I don't, I'm going to feed, Scott on this podcast said I can feed 30%, so I'm whacking 3 kilos of dry matter of beet pulp to this horse. You're going to have problems. I mean, any
Mm-hmm.
transition to feed that drastic is going to create issues. If you are questioning, you're like, I got this much hay left, I'm really questioning whether I'm going to get some, I'm going to start to increase my beet pulp inclusion now. Um, it would easily be able to go 20, 30% inclusion of replacement. And again, these are situations we use rule of thumbs, and nutritionists and people in general. We're super cautious. Like, we never want to be like, oh yeah, just feed your whole diet beet pulp; it'll be totally fine.
Yeah.
But ultimately, a lot of times you get in situations and people end up doing things like that, and the horses do survive. And then you find out you're like you can, and then you may find out some deleterious side effects of doing these types of things. But as like a general rule, like that 20%, 30% level. The other big thing you have to consider when doing any of this is you really need to balance this diet still, right? Like, it's not just I've run out of hay, I'm gonna replace it with beet pulp. Like, if your average hay has a digestible energy content of, say, just 2 megacals per kilo. So just to put this in perspective for the horse, I get most people like don't think in megacals, but your 20 megacals is well over your maintenance requirement for a 500 kilo horse. So that's your average hay you would have in BC. It was probably even a little higher in BC just because of the quality of the grass there. You take and then switch that to beet pulp, which will be pushing 3.3 megacals per kilo, or even just 3 megacals per kilo, depending on how you determine it. But the point being, it's a third again higher in energy content.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to account for that when you're changing these feedstuffs and the energy balance that you're changing. Then you also, you do need to obviously account for the minerals and the protein. Some of the byproducts like beet pulp, citrus pulp, all the horses don't love citrus pulp, um, will be quite low in protein. Others like, you're out west, you may get a wheat distillers, will be quite high in protein. So you have to be careful about how much you feed of something like that that's really high in protein, because you don't want excessive amounts of protein going into the horse. So again, is this is why we do what we do. It's really important to talk to a qualified nutritionist, particularly if you're making big changes in your diet and what ingredients you are going to include and how you're going to include them and how you're going to transition from a given diet to another one.
For sure, that totally makes sense. It's good to know how much you can feed of like the extra forage stuff if you have to, because it does also really suck that like the hay replacements that they have, like the hay cubes and pellets, that the horses can eat them so quickly because they're not really like hay replacers then, because they don't serve the same purpose, I guess. And I figured they eat them way faster because when like my guys get them with their supplement meals, they'll have the soaked forage meals. And like they eat them way faster than they could possibly eat like a flake of hay. But
For sure.
yeah, like it sucks that horses are like so much more finicky than other animals, because like the hay and the grass thing is like a pretty big deal. And like here at least too, the problem is that like through the winter you can't really count on having grass unless you have tons of land, because it's
Right.
too wet and they tear it up. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of what happens, because I think a lot of people are going to end up needing to downsize, or they're going to have to find different means of like helping their horses get forage, because I think that there's going to end up being some issues, especially if we get another bad year again through the summer and stuff. I'm hoping that it won't be like that, but like yeah, it's kind of a scary thing because it's not just BC that's been having the shortages. It's so many surrounding areas where we would typically outsource hay from as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an issue. Like, forage is always like, even just you're in a situation where you have shortages, and then other places, it's not just shortages, there's the price, right? Like when forages get really expensive and stretch people's budgets, and it gets hard to do those, feed them uh, your herd. Like, it's just
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the prices have gone up and they're like astronomical now. I still don't know, like I haven't tried it obviously because I wouldn't want to, but I don't know how much, like how the price would compare to do like forage alternatives in comparison to hay if you started to phase out how much hay you're feeding. But like the price per bale and whatnot here has become like it's gone way up. Like I've seen some dealers that have almost doubled their prices from last year, to try to like account for, I guess, the losses that they would have had from not being able to cut as much. So yeah, things are going to get a little crazy, I think. So it'll be interesting to see how people start to adapt, because I would say in my area, like there definitely are a lot of cows, but like Langley, the area that I'm in, is like the horse capital of BC. So I
Yeah.
would imagine that a lot of the hay dealers are probably selling to horse owners. So if we keep getting like wet seasons, I'm interested to see if they start adapting by doing like what you mentioned earlier with the fermentable forages, and kind of start figuring out ways to do that safely and make it practical. Because if the weather keeps staying like this, it's unlikely that they're going to keep having the same yields that they would have in years past.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, who knows? I mean, like this may push somebody to become super innovative and put like fermentation system up and then dry for you. I mean, alfalfa pellets largely, they come off the field fairly wet. They go through a dryer for the most part and then get pelleted. If you threw one more step in there and fermented it first, like if you did grasses like that, I don't know if it's feasible, but again, there may be a market for it eventually. If the problem persists. But like when you talk about bag forages and stuff like that, they're still, it's still the preference probably. Like if you're looking for a forage alternative, that's probably still your number one preference. And yes, it's absolutely going to cost more than a bale of hay. Um, Anytime, you get people getting their hands on it, has to be handled more. There's
Hmm.
processing involved, and I know like when you say, square bales are getting very expensive, but when you actually figure out per kilo, hay so will always be probably the most affordable or most economical option,
Yeah,
even when it is expensive, because typically even when hay prices are going up, so is everything else.
yeah,
Uh,
for sure.
so it's just a, kind of a matter of fact of this of where we're at, I guess, today.
Yeah.
Uh, but the other thing too, a lot of people soak their forages or beet pulp, which trying to avoid choke usually is the reason they do that. Because anybody's had a horse that's choked, it's a terrible experience, and you always,
Hmm.
of course, you want to try to avoid that. But the downside to doing it is it also speeds up ingestion. So,
Yeah.
you're looking at forage alternatives, and you're like, okay, well, I want to slow this horse down eating, but I need to soak this, and that's just going to speed up the ability for this horse to eat it because it doesn't need to saturate it anymore. It's already saturated. So you've taken that whole step of the mastication process out, or done it
Hmm.
for them essentially. But it's still, I would say that's still your number one choice. If you can't, or you're really limited on hay, try to stretch the hay as far as possible by adding a bit of straw. Go with the either the pellets or the cube forages, and then you can start looking at some of the grain byproducts or beet pulp to
Hmm.
add in as replacements to start stretching um, that, and then look at unique ways just to essentially improve the welfare of your horse
Yeah.
uh, by the fact that they're not going to be eating all the time.
Would it work then? And like, and this is not like nutrition wise, but for the behavioral aspect, if like as a way to adapt to less hay, there is like, if you're gonna feed soaked stuff, for example, is like almost like I want to say like puzzle feeders, like almost like what for dogs, where they have to kind of like work a little harder to get the stuff. But for horses, it would of course have to be different in a way where they can still get the food fairly easily, but it slows them down. And then kind of just moving those things around their turnout area, or like planting like would planting like horse safe plants that are not grass potentially help fulfill the foraging need, even though they won't be consuming the volume that they would with hay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I encourage you, like, any adding variety into your paddock's always a great idea in terms of giving something else to eat. I'm not sure you're going to be able to fulfill their foraging needs with it. Um, but like more to your point of like not the puzzles or things, I think there's lots of inventive ways to do things like that to keep the horse busy. And that's really all you're doing, right? You're just keeping them busy doing what they want to be doing. That's eating. It doesn't necessarily have to be shut with their head shoved in a bale of hay. You know, years ago, well, not that many years ago, we were looking at basically, those lick tubs of molasses that the cattle use, doing something like that with the horses. And if you put like a fiber solution into that kind of lick roll, that's something that would, could keep a horse going for probably a number of hours, giving them a little bit of fiber as they did it, keeping the hind gut happy and really making a balance. It's just like it really hasn't been tested, but again, this is where, a lot of innovation always comes out of the field. It doesn't have to come out of university. So I would encourage people, yeah, to experiment with different things to enrich the environment for the horse and delay the time it takes them to actually get the food. I mean, we've been doing it for dogs for a long time. Give them a ball with treats, they got to roll around forever until it falls out. You could
Yeah,
do.
yeah, I
There's no.
think
There's no
so.
reason you can't do that with hay. I think there actually is that for horses on the market now, and
Yeah,
just
the
throw hay.
hay balls are a thing now.
Yeah,
For sure.
just something for them to do. Like that's really what you want versus standing there staring at their stall, eating wood, eating the bedding and their manure, right? Like you're just
Yeah.
trying to fill an activity that is similar to foraging.
Yeah, and I think the behavioral thing is what I would be the most worried about if we had a shortage, because I would it just seems like an absolute nightmare, the idea of not being able to access hay and just seeing how upset the horses would get. This has been really helpful because it gives ideas on how to potentially cope with like any challenges that might end up happening due to the shortages we've been having.
As they say, crisis is just opportunity. Like, not this is necessarily a crisis per se, but yeah, opportunity to experiment and try new things and kind of do things a little differently. Again, within the like confines of reason. Like as I mentioned earlier, to meet the nutritional needs is actually relatively straightforward. Consult a nutritionist and like with your idea of like this is how much I'm gonna do, like if it's the horse ball for instance, and it's how much I'm gonna put in here, and hopefully that'll keep them busy for this long, and this is what we're actually gonna feed it in total. Is that balance? And you're like, yeah. Now you sort out how to make that activity last, 8 to 12 hours, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be, yeah, I think that's the thing is the all of the slow feed options that are out there right now are very much centered around feeding like a fibrous hay rather than anything soaked or anything
Yeah.
pelleted. So that would be the challenge, but that's a good idea because I think that like regardless of whether the shortages last, if there was feeding options that started to be created for that, those types of things would make it a little easier for people who have horses that can't chew and consume normal hay in the same way as like a healthy horse could. Like I know a lot of elderly horses that are on mostly soaked diets.
Yeah.
um and in a case like that, I guess, would you say that like the not being able to chew properly or not having teeth would slow them down enough where it's like more viable to do a soaked feeding diet with those types of horses who have dentition issues? And obviously, in those cases, it's out of necessity because they can't consume regular hay. But would that slow them down enough, or is that still a problem that you see for horses who can't access regular forage diets?
Yeah, like it definitely slows. Obviously, the dentition issue slows them down considerably. And then, I mean, you're kind of putting a few different variables in here because a lot of horses with dentition issues are quite old, so maybe not being as active isn't as big of an issue for them. Just their activity levels are just naturally declining, anyways. Um, and so, yeah, it does, but it does usually take them quite a long time to consume the feed, and so, but it would still be an issue, I think, anytime you're taking away kind of the ability to eat for 10 to 12 hours. And I'm not aware though of anybody's done any of this work in elderly horses to see does it really negatively impact them to have this shortened foraging time, or they content enough just to eat this basically soup that they're being consuming per day. It ends up being like quite a large quantity of soup for those horses though.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it
they
does
end up
take them
eating a
quite some
lot.
time to get through it.
Yeah, for
The
sure.
other thing I am, and so I think almost every nutrition talk I give or talk about nutrition, salt comes into here. Um, So this is one thing, you're talking about soaking, and we can like reduce the amount of water we add to it and avoid things like choke by using salt uh, on everything essentially. Again, you want to meter it out so it's not crazy levels because you don't want to stop them from eating completely because you made it too
Mhm.
salty. But by adding salt, you're going to force them to drink, right? It's no different than us. If we eat something really salty, we reach for the glass of water to basically balance it out, and the horse will do very much the same thing. Where if you're adding a bit of salt into that forage blend that you've watered down, it's going to slow them down, and maybe you don't water it down quite as much, so it does slow them down more. But by adding the salt, they'll go drink more water and be less concerned with things like choke, or any other issues
Yeah.
related with consuming some of these dry byproducts.
For like the average horse, how much salt would you recommend? Like if you're adding salt to like their food to help prevent things like choke, like what would the ideal amount be?
Well, the requirement is going to be 1 ounce a day. So you're, looking at a full ounce to me, because all the feedstuffs a horse consume really have very low levels of sodium, and
Hmm.
so essentially we need to supplement almost all their salt requirement. But in a case where you're like, well, I'd actually want to use the salt to restrict them a little bit, I have no issue going up to 2 ounces a day of salt into getting them to eat that. And this is where you run into some issues. People, taking human dietary information and trying to train it on the horse and worrying about health effects of too much salt. Your horse is suffering from too little salt all the time. You're not. It's highly unlikely that you're going to overdo it with any reasonable amount of salt you're giving them.
Yeah,
But I
two
would
ounces
say
is a lot.
easily
Like, yeah,
easily up to 2 ounces a day is fine.
yeah. And then if they're working, would you feed more salt? Because I know they sweat out a lot of their salt. So on like hot days or when they're sweating or working, is that amount like accounting for that as well, or is that just like a regular horse at rest?
So the 1 ounce is just a regular horse eye rest being their daily requirement. Yeah, as soon as you start increasing the temperature and workload, like their salt requirement goes up dramatically. It is the one nutrient that increases the most, like, realistically, as a percentage, more than energy, more than protein, more than anything, is their salt requirement goes up because they are one of the one of the sweatiest species in the of all mammals. Real, like, legitimately, they sweat more than basically any other mammal per unit of body weight, um, and within that sweat is a lot of salt. Anybody that's had a horse sees the salt stains in the summertime on everything, right?
Hmm.
um, so you're, again, for a horse working in the summertime, you like 2 ounces would, like, a lot of times is just meeting the requirement. If you're feeding 2 ounces a day, so you, even for those horses, you could start adding a little bit more. It is the one nutrient where horses do have some nutritional knowledge. So when you're short, they'll seek it out. You'll see them licking a lot of stuff. It's probably like they're probably low on salt, and this is why I really really like loose free choice salt, because the most horses will just balance it themselves. When you work them, as long as they have access to clean fresh water, they'll go
Hmm.
consume the amount of salt they need and balance it out.
When you're feeding loose salt free choice, like what type of setup do you feed it in? Because I tried that, but my horses pick up like the bowls that they're in and like fling them around. So they don't or if it rains, then the salt's just gone. So I've been trying to brainstorm the best course of, like, I was thinking of drilling my bowl down into their feeder or on a wall or something so they can't grab it and throw it places. But yeah, how do you feed it?
Well, if you have like run-in sheds or anything like that, or anywhere where like you do have a corner where you could mount a bowl, like a corner mounted just small bowl, it's fantastic. Because you don't necessarily want a huge amount in there. Obviously, salt absorbs moisture very quickly, and then particularly if they're licking, it's going to turn into a block. So it's something you kind of want to renew regularly. You don't need it to be this huge tub. So like
Okay.
a corner thing of like a stainless steel bowl or a rubber bowl that, yeah, you screw to the wall is a great way to do it. Or even if they're in stalls for part of the day, in a corner of a stall, then if it's in a stall, I'd be more apt to use a rubber one in the corner.
Okay, perfect. Yeah,
But
that
yeah,
sounds
the small and like the smaller size, right? You don't want this big, huge thing that they can, because
yeah.
they're gonna play with it, right? Like, regardless if they're salted or not, it's just chew on it and try and throw it around and stuff. So
Yeah. get into everything. That's great to know about the salt. Yeah, because that's an ounce of salt a day is crazy. Because that's like a shot glass. Is that not like a shot glass full of salt?
Yeah, it is.
Crazy.
So that's just
In
that's their
comparison,
baseline
like how much
requirement.
salt do people get? Because I know we don't sweat out as much salt. I'm gonna look this up quickly.
I think it's 1 gram a day is what your salt
Wow,
is for humans.
that's yeah.
So it'd be 2 grams, roughly 2 grams, so 2 to 3 grams of salt. Your 1 gram of sodium, I think,
And
is a,
people probably go over their salt requirements rather than under, I'm assuming, because
well, that is the issue with humans, like, because like every processed food manufacturer knows, fat, sugar, and salt are the three things humans crave, and so they put too much of all those things in there. Like he doesn't take a research program to look at Western society and go, "Oh,
yeah.
what's wrong with our diets here?" Um, as much as we try to make it complicated, it really isn't that complicated. Um, and so, there's sodium in everything, like every processed food, or like even going to restaurants, world-class chefs want your food to taste good. They want your steak to taste good, so they salt it,
Hmm.
because you're going to enjoy it. So
Yeah.
we're at the opposite end of the spectrum of sodium intake, and we don't sweat a lot of salt like horses do. We sweat water, like lots of water, but it's a hypotonic solution, whereas
Hmm.
horses are iso to almost hypertonic at times. What they're sweating, and that just means basically they sweat out a lot more salt, where we sweat out very little salt when we
Do you
sweat.
know if there's like a functional purpose for them sweating out that much salt? Because it seems like kind of a flaw in their system if they lose that much of their salt.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, and I'm unprepared to answer that at this time. I've read some stuff on it, and then, there's talk that like some, we've said their salt requirements actually too high. Although this gets into problems because again, the majority of diets we see, we're really deficient in the amount of salt the horses are consuming. But in some cases where we're doing like perform 100-mile endurance horses, we're probably on the high end of estimating how much we need to replace in a 100-mile race. And I'm getting away from your question that you asked of, is there a functional purpose to it? Surely there is some evolutionary advantage to it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be this way.
Hmm.
I don't actually know what it is.
I
No.
wonder if it's something to do with keeping bugs off or something, if it has anything to do with that or cooling or something, because that would at least make sense. But I mean, their digestive systems and stuff in general doesn't necessarily seem like it was created in the most best way to have, like, because they just have so many more problems than even cows, from what I gather, like digestive wise. So horses are
Well,
just flawed species. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if they're flawed. The domestication of the horses, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's a very short window, and it could be maybe what we've asked them to do is not what they were evolved to necessarily exactly do, and we've introduced some issues into this
Yeah.
situation.
So do
Um,
you think then, like with like the digestive issues we see with horses, like I'm guessing the most common ones would be ulcers and colic. Do you
yeah,
think that if the horse world across like as an industry kept horses in like a forage based lifestyle and like where they can move around more, that those issues would not be anywhere near as rampant as they're seen now?
yeah. I think we underestimate what stresses horses. Again, get back to the salt conversation. Sometimes we anthropomorphize horses, and we're like, well, whatever humans need or want must be the same as horses, and I don't think it is the same. Like, well, I know it's not, obviously. There's similarities, but like things as little as changing paddock mates. To us, it
Mhm.
may seem like an inconsequential change, but you're talking about a herd animal that has a very distinct structure in the wild, and we disturb that all the time. And
Mhm.
I don't know that we give it enough credence to how much we're disturbing it and think about it. Just again, you get kind of too used to how everything is today, or and not really looking at the bigger picture. So I think there is a lot of things we could do to minimize ulcers. Like when you look at exercising horses, it's probably going to be an issue just due to the physical nature of splashing acid up on the gut when they run. I'm not sure we're ever going to get around that. Um, from the exercising horse standpoint, but that's only actually, when you're talking about these horses that are working like 6, 7 days a week at a high level, that's really a very small percentage of the population of horses. Whereas when you start looking at the ulcer incidence, it's a very high percentage of the population of
Yeah.
horses. So there's clearly, um, as I mentioned, a lot of these other stressors that are impacting these horses that are creating
Yeah.
some of these issues, and certainly the feeding situation too. And I just mentioned feeding straw versus hay. Uh, Horses are more prone to ulcers feeding straw. There's, again, there's less buffering capacity and other issues with hay. Now, as I say that, this is probably what people are going to remember. So I want to backtrack a little bit. Straw is still a good alternative if you're short on forage. It does a lot of things and it does them well. It's just one of the minor side differences, I guess, would be a slightly higher incidence of ulcers in
Yeah.
those
That
cases.
makes sense. I'm guessing that's probably like more relevant the more straw you feed in place of hay, because would hay kind of help balance it if you're mixing it in hay, or would it still kind of carry the same risk?
I think a lot of it's buffering. So yeah, as you put more and more straw in, the risk is probably going to increase. Like, you take alfalfa as being the most buffering. And again, you talk about ulcers in horses, alfalfa is one of the most common recommendations, including some level, not as the full sole forage source, because it buffers so well. And it's a natural kind of buffer. And then even some of the very uh, I call them very lignified or high uh, fiber haze would tend towards more straw on the straw scale in terms of, I guess, incidence of ulceration when feeding. So it's not just a straw thing; it's more the chemical composition and how well the forage actually
Interesting.
buffers.
So which hays would be kind of more like straw where they'd carry the higher risk of ulcers? Are there specific types that are kind of like not like, I guess if you were gonna like rate top tier hays, are there certain types that are kind of like I would stay away from these grasses in particular?
No, honestly, no. Again, it wouldn't. The ulcer risk, like when you're looking at it from that point of forage, I wouldn't really even bring that into the equation in terms of my feeding practice. I'd be more concerned again with meeting the nutritional needs where I want to select these forages because my horse is doing this level of work and this is what is required to fulfill its eating requirement and its nutrient needs.
Hmm.
And then maybe it's like a tertiary consideration, like, okay, well, is this a higher risk of the horse getting ulcers? And it's not really, because again, if you're meeting its foraging needs, it's not a big risk anyways. It's a lot of the other management factors that are going to be bigger risks than the actual composition of the forages you're feeding.
If a horse person was like planting a grass field or a field that they intended to hay, would there be like choice grasses to pick to plant in there? In specific, like in terms like not for selling purposes, because I know there's probably ones that are way more lucrative, but for like fulfilling dietary needs.
Again, and I think you brought this up last time. I probably skirted the question then too. I'm
Mm,
certainly not an agronomist. This is not my area of expertise. But I will say this: like every area is different. I mean, you kind of need to balance what your soil weather conditions are like to what grows best there, to what, and then match it to what your horse needs as closely as you can. Like in like where I live in southwestern Ontario, it's very rare to get like a pure grass stand because you get one cut of pure
mhm.
grass and then it just droughts out for the rest of the summer and you get nothing back. But if you plant alfalfa in the mix, you'll tend to at least get two cuts off of
Cool.
it. And so your agronomic consideration is such that we need to mix some things in there to make sure it grows and we get enough volume that we can actually feed our horses. And then we can balance out to that. But like, I mean, the typical horse, the brome, the timothies, and things like that are all good grasses to grow for your horses. What I would like to see, as much as anything, consideration would be stage of maturity that these things are cut. And I get that a lot of horse people don't have control over this because, they only have one or two horses. You're just buying hay from a dealer. You have no say over um, when they're cutting and then time
Mhm.
of day even, right? Like, again, if you want low sugar hay, the best time of day to cut is in the morning.
Mhm.
And this goes contrary because for a cattle farmer, you want to cut late afternoon when your sugar content's the highest because you're trying to get as much nutrition into this hay as possible Whereas for the vast majority of horse owners now, the hay's not the nutrition, like although it's providing the majority of the nutrition, it's not like it needs to be packed with nutrients, um, because a lot of the horses we're keeping today, meeting their energy and protein needs isn't the issue anymore. It's fulfilling that foraging need without overdoing the energy and protein requirements. And I'm sure there's a lot of listeners on here go, my horse is, my horse needs to gain weight. What's this guy
Mhm.
talking about? But
Mhm.
we see a lot of diets, and the vast majority of the time you're like, nah, it's too much energy in these diets for these horses. Like we're growing too good of hays and forages for what we're asking those horses to do. Um, so one of two things, like we need to like feed them less energy or start working them more. And I would lean more towards start working them more, because I think it's
Mhm.
better for the horse and the horse owners, honestly.
Yeah, that sounds, yeah, smarter. And yeah, especially I'm guessing like for horses like that don't have a lot of space to move around on their own time, the amount of calories that they'd need to burn in comparison to a horse who's in work and also on turnout would probably be a lot lower. I'm assuming just from how much they can move around if they're given the room.
Yeah, I mean, we have a significant Mennonite population that lives just to the north of us, and the reason I bring this up is to put things in perspective for people, because again, they're like, well, I ride my horse an hour a day, 5 days a week, and they're like, so that's considered they consider that medium to almost heavy work,
Mhm.
and I'm like, that's not even close to heavy work for a horse. Like your horse is an oxidative machine with the capacity to do so much work. Um, Far more than will most people ever even come close to working them. And which is why I bring up, these horses pulling buggies, 20, 30 miles, 40 miles a day. Uh,
Wow.
right. And they're doing it quite easily. They look quite fit. I mean, you're like, yeah, they're well fed, they're well taken care of, they're capable of performing this level of work. Um, so yeah, again, it's just increasing the amount of exercise is always a good option. And that is totally off topic of forage
Yeah.
alternatives. It's
No, that's really interesting though, because yeah, just the different energy requirements and whatnot. And for the forage alternatives thing, I think that, like you've covered a lot of stuff related to food that would help people kind of troubleshoot um, anything like hay shortages, for example. Um, the last question I have for you is just regarding teff hay because it's a newer hay, and I just wanted to know your opinion on it because for the low sugar and stuff, it's getting popular here, and I've started feeding it for my fat horse. But I was just wondering, like from a nutritionist standpoint, what are the thoughts on that as like an up and coming hay that I'm assuming will start getting planted more now that a lot of people are buying it?
yeah, I mean, it's been fed a lot, and certainly in other countries, as you mentioned, is gaining popularity here. Again, any forage that meets the nutrient requirements of the horse and the I guess the psychological behavioral requirements of the horse is, yeah, absolutely is a great choice to add in there. And Tefe fits, kind of fits into that bill, fits
Yeah.
into that area.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this again. I think that's all of the questions I have to ask today, but yeah, that was really great. You always help me learn so many things when you come on this podcast.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. Again, I hope people find value in it. Again, we're always here to answer questions, and fortunately, there's people a lot smarter than me working here that can help out anybody that has nutrition related questions.
That's great. Yeah, no, it has been helpful for a lot of people. I've gotten really good feedback on these podcasts because equine nutrition is something that I think a lot of horse owners don't really have access to learning because their trainers and barn owners control so much of what's going on in the diet related stuff. So I like the podcasts have gotten really good feedback and people have found it extremely helpful. And same with your diet analysis for that matter.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. I'm very happy to hear. Yeah, we definitely encourage people to get their diets evaluated, because unless you know what your horse is consuming, it's really hard to know if you're doing the right or where you need to change things.
For sure. And yeah, you provide a very accessible option. So for anyone who's interested, MadBarn does free diet analysis and you can go on their website to check that out. I'll link it in the podcast description. And yeah, that's a great way to get a diet balance to see what you need to add for your horse.
The one thing I do want to add, because a lot of times we talk about this diet analysis, it's always about fixing problems or horses with issues. Like it's a great exercise, even if you have the most amazing looking horse that is completely healthy and is on the greatest nutrition program, just from a monitoring standpoint,
Mm.
to put numbers to like put numbers to why your horse is doing so well. So if down the road something does happen, and you've got this kind of dietary history to go by, you're like, well, this changed and this changed, and we're a lot lower in protein now or something, whatever it may be. Maybe, it gives you a lot more insight to making sure your nutrition program is correct. And then if things are changing or in a direction that you may not be great, then at least you have the historical data to go from as
Yeah.
well on that.
No, that's a really good point. I think that, yeah, for a lot of people listening to that, they should consider that, because I hadn't thought about that either for my own horses. But now that I have the diet analysis, that's definitely something that I'll do if any of them start having anything change, especially since we're feeding the same hay and whatnot. So it'll stay the same. So that's a really good thought. Yeah.
I have a whole podcast on things staying the same. Nothing ever stays the same. But
Yeah. Yeah. No,
even you're
for
like, oh,
sure.
it's the
Nothing
same hay.
works.
I'm like, no, it's not. It's not the same hay.
Yeah. Slightly I bet, yeah, even if you just do flake by flake, I bet there'd be different um levels for everything. But
Oh, the variation within is huge, which is why when like we talk about sampling, getting large samples is key because if you take it from a microscopic level, you talk about the blind men and the elephant, that whole story. you know, you, you need a bigger picture,
mhm,
particularly with nutrition and particularly with hay. Our nutrition, there's a great buffering system. We've evolved to have amazing buffering systems where you can be nutrient deficient for a long time and still come out of it and be fine. So you really, when you're looking at a nutrition program, it's not about, the micrograms per day of something. It's really long term, making sure we're within within these, yeah, confines, I guess, and staying within it. It's fine if it sways a little bit in and out once in a while. You just want to make sure it's not long term
mhm.
out all the time. Because yeah, if you just do it flake by flake and took samples and sent them in, you'd be like, this isn't even the same. Hey, what is this?
Yeah. So with like a large sample for hay, like how large is large? Like how big of a sample are we talking for like the most accurate testing?
So we like to do up to 10 bales, basically,
Oh,
and not
wow.
just 10 side by
That is
side, because
large.
there's a good chance those things came from, like, if you have a whole mow, try to get up to 10 bales in cord. So
Mhm.
like using one of those probes that goes through all the flakes, not all the
Mhm.
whole bale necessarily, but a good 2 feet into it.
Yeah.
And even if you don't have that option, one of the blog posts talks about this, but like if you grab handfuls and then you just cut basically the hay off each side of your hand, so you're just left with the width of your basically 4 inches of sample in your hand, and drop that in a bag, and then do that from 10 different bales. At least that kind of gets you more representative
Okay.
sample versus particularly like when you have mixed in almost everybody is going to have a mix. Um, whether grass or even legume grass mix in their hay, like it's almost unheard of to have a homogeneous, with the exception of maybe alfalfa,
Yeah.
uh, um, hay. So, but again, you're going to have spots where one plant grows much better than the other, and it'll totally outcompete it, and it'll be all that one plant. And then you'll
Mhm.
move, a windrow or two over, and the conditions will be quite different, and you'll have a more heterogeneous mix of plants in there. And that's really why I want this whole kind of like
Yeah.
broad-based sampling.
Okay, perfect. That's great to know. Thank you again. That's, yeah, so much to take away from this. Yeah. So thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And we always learn something on here. So I appreciate all the time you give to providing people with free resources to learn about equine nutrition.
Thank you for tuning into another Making Milestones podcast. I hope people enjoyed this one and that they learned something new. And yeah, stay tuned for more podcasts. I try to post as frequently as I can whenever I have motivation, and I always appreciate the support. If anyone is interested in supporting my business in other ways, I do have a Patreon channel that you can subscribe to for as little as $1 a month for behind the scenes tutorials, training help, and more. You just have to select a tier depending on what you're looking for, and you can do that at patreon.com/SDEQUUS, SDEquus, and you can subscribe to that for as little as $1 a month. I also do have a bridle line, and we've just restocked the bitless and bitted bridles, so those are available for order on my friend's business website, the Amore Equestrian website, AMORE equestrian.ca, and they're under the milestone page where you can find my bridles, apparel, and more. We've also released some really cool summer base layers and summer shirts for riding in that are really cute, and I highly recommend checking them out. I've tried to keep prices affordable so that they are within the budget of all sorts of equestrians, and yeah, I recommend checking them out. Comfort and affordability and style was a huge priority of mine when making all that stuff, so those are available. We also have a bunch of our saddle pads on sale now because we're just trying to clear out products, so highly recommend checking that out. And I appreciate anyone supporting the business by listening to the podcast, joining Patreon, sharing any of my posts, sharing and reviewing the business side of things with our products, purchasing products, anything. It's all super helpful and I really appreciate it. We are still looking to move as much product as we can to try to catch up for Milo's vet bills because he does need to go in for an arthroscopy in the future. So I'm currently saving for that so that he can go and get that done, and then he should be up to date on everything he needs for the current lameness explorations that we've been doing. He had his MRI. It went really well. For anyone who missed the discussion about that, I do have a podcast that goes more in depth to that, but the results were basically best case scenario. So anyways, really appreciate it. Just looking to continue clearing up product, and I highly recommend checking that out and the Patreon out, especially if you're looking for training help. Patreon's the most affordable way to get that. There's a lot of tutorials that I already have live on there. So yeah, check that out, and thank you for listening.